Well, Palita is Sri Lanka's permanent representative to the UN. In the aftermath of the Sri Lankan government's victory over the Tamil Tigers, he signed the order to expel James Elder, the Australian who, as spokesman for UNICEF in Sri Lanka, dared to speak out about the treatment of displaced Tamils in detention camps. Well, earlier today, Palita joined me from New York to talk about his country's detention centres and the growing problem with Sri Lankan asylum seekers. Palita, thanks for joining us.
Hello.
What can Sri Lanka do to stop the large number of Tamils who are fleeing your country in small boats?
I think this whole characterization of a large number of Tamils escaping Sri Lanka is wrong. It's a total mischaracterization. There were, I think, about 200 Tamils who went across to Australia, about another 70 who came to Canada. It looks now, after the investigations have commenced, that many of them never started their journey in Sri Lanka. They came from elsewhere. From what I've heard, the crowd that went to Australia certainly did not originate their journey in Sri Lanka. They came from somewhere else. If they were actually escaping from Sri Lanka, one has to ask the question as to why they did not escape to India, which is only 22 miles away from Sri Lanka, rather than go all the way to Australia.
So you simply deny there's a push factor, bearing in mind the push factor the Australian government's talking about is conditions on the ground in Sri Lanka.
I think this talk about the push factor is an over-exaggeration. If there were, as I said, a push factor, why didn't they go across to India, which is so close by, 22 miles away from Sri Lanka? Instead, they head all the way to Australia. There must be another reason than a simple push factor here. The magnet of Australia, which many of us discovered years ago, is still there. It's a magnet. Australia attracts people. In the absence of a push factor, it's the magnetic attraction of Australia that has brought these people to Australia's shores illegally.
Well, your government's had representations from Prime Minister Rudd, from the Foreign Minister Stephen Smith, and now there's a special Australian envoy who's been sent to Sri Lanka. So what kind of cooperation will all this diplomatic activity bring?
Sri Lanka has cooperated very closely with Australia over the last few months, maybe even the last few years, to bring this illicit migration to Australia under control. We have agreed to Australia placing additional staff in the Australian mission in Colombo. Our security services have cooperated very closely with Australian authorities, and in fact we have sought Australian assistance to monitor our own seas so that we could control illegal movements of boats from Sri Lanka to other countries. I must say that the two countries have worked very closely on these issues.
One idea that's being talked about is some sort of maritime cooperation. Now, could you imagine a joint Sri Lankan-Australian naval operation to intercept and turn back boats leaving Sri Lanka?
I can imagine that happening because, in fact, we successfully countered illegal LTTE movements of weapons and explosives into Sri Lanka by actually confronting LTT vessels out at sea. We could do that again, but we need the cooperation of friendly countries because our naval capabilities are limited.
So would you actually welcome Australian naval forces in your waters cooperating with the small Sri Lankan Navy?
We have asked Australia to assist us to improve our own defence capabilities, so that and also so that we could improve our Coast Guard. So if Sri Lanka had a developed Coast Guard facility, I think we could do this job ourselves. We wouldn't need vessels from other countries to do it for us. But we certainly would look forward to working with Australia in order to stop this illicit movement of vessels from Sri Lanka.
How closely are you monitoring all these human dramas that are taking place at the moment? We've had a Sri Lankan boat that capsized at sea with loss of life. There are 78 Tamils who are refusing to leave an Australian vessel that's anchored offshore in Indonesian waters. And of course there are a large number of Tamils who are refusing to leave another boat that was intercepted by the Indonesian Navy. How closely are you monitoring these events and how concerned are you about them?
These events have hit the headlines around the world, so it's not too difficult to monitor what's going on. And I think it is wrong for anybody to go to a strange land and then exert emotional pressure of this kind on the intended destination and expect people to react positively. I think this is emotional blackmail. People going and sitting on leaking vessels and then refusing to get off those vessels. In the first instance, there is a legal manner in which people could migrate to Australia. This avenue was not used. Instead, they used an illicit method. And now they are exerting pressure on the Australian authorities to accommodate them. I think it's wrong.
Well, it appears that some of these people, particularly those on the Australian ship, have already been recognised as refugees, so they have rights beyond those of asylum seekers, don't they?
That's a decision for the Australian authorities to make. If Australia recognizes them as refugees, that is something that the Australian authorities have to deal with. Personally, I do not think that they are refugees unless you use that expression in a rather loose manner. They are economic refugees looking for greener pastures elsewhere.
So are you suggesting that they be sent back to Sri Lanka?
Certainly, yes. Sri Lanka will accept them. They are our citizens. We will take them back.
Well, they say they can't be sent back to Sri Lanka because they're fleeing oppression. They fear they'll be killed or tortured or imprisoned if they are forced to return.
I would ask you a rhetorical question here. How many refugees have you seen, have we come across, who speak so well in English, who seem to be so well fed and reasonably well clothed? You just need to come to Colombo. Most of the businesses, leading business houses, are run by Tamils, owned by Tamils. Most of the professionals are Tamils. 39% of the capital of Sri Lanka, Colombo, is Tamil. It will be very difficult to find anybody who would agree with that allegation that the Tamils are oppressed in Sri Lanka.
Since your military crushed the Tamil Tigers, hundreds of thousands of Tamils have been held in internment camps, and since then reports have been circulating in the Tamil community in particular of bad conditions in the camps, of rapes, of ill treatment, of people being picked up and disappearing. What do you say to those claims?
What else would you expect from the old LTT propaganda machine? They continue to churn out stories such as these. For one thing, the camps were not internment camps. In fact, we started off with 294,000 people in the camps. As of last night, only 138,000 are left in the camps. The others have gone back to their own villages and their towns. This movement will continue. We expect to have the bulk of the people in the camps back in their villages by the end of January. I'm quite confident that this will happen. And then this talk about rape and all sorts of other things. If you had seen the tents in those camps, they are placed one against the other. If there were any incidents of rape, not only would the neighbors hear what was going on, the entire campsite would hear about it. I think these are just gross fabrications, exaggerations in fact, because we ourselves have not heard of any such allegations.
One of the problems your government faces is that international observers have not been allowed to go into the camps and remain in the camps. Why are international aid workers and observers not allowed free and unfettered access to these camps?
Tony, you seem to believe the Tamil propaganda line, the LTT propaganda line, very easily.
Well, this is what the aid workers are saying themselves, not Tamil propagandists.
Let me explain it. There are 54 non-governmental agencies working in those camps as I speak to you. They have been there for the last 6 months. So it is absolutely untrue to say that international observers have not been in those camps. The UNDP is in those camps. The UNICEF is in those camps. UNHCR is in those camps. So I do not know where you get these stories from, other than from